Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. My name is Chris Weuve. You're watching Starfleet Tactical. And for those of you who were here last week, you can probably guess without even checking that the weather in Western Maryland is bad, because otherwise I would be in Ohio getting ready to come back. But Ohio was supposed to be like insanely cold. It's insanely cold here in DC. And it was supposed to be like whiteout conditions potentially in Western Maryland. So I'm doing a show after all. And so tonight we're going to do a show on what I'm calling, I think I named it the 5-year mission. How many ships to keep one forward? I just went with how many ships to keep one forward in the YouTube, the title, because YouTube limits you to only 100 characters. And so I always want to keep the date information there because it makes it easier for me to go back and find them and for other people to find them. So I'm kind of limited, but it's basically, so why is it a 5-year mission? I think I've got some ideas about why it's a 5-year mission, and I'm going to do that by comparing it to how ship deployments work in the real world, et cetera, et cetera. It should be a lot of fun. So Pat Doyle says hi. I spoke with him earlier today. He is spending the evening with his wife. He's taking a week of leave, or he's off for like the first time. I think he said he spent 6 months at home, or 6 months, 6 days at home in the month of December. And so he's looking forward to just spending some quality time with Linda. So that's what he's up to. So let me go ahead and launch this. Yeah, snow is cold to the touch. We got an ice storm here before, and it was really, really bad. And so, yeah, I am not in favor of ice in any way, shape, or form, except in my drink. So, okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the 5-year mission. How many starships do you need to keep one deployed? So I'm not going to get into like the size of the fleet. We talked about that in like episode 178, 179, something like that. A little bit about how to think about that. This one is actually more about how to think about, okay, if I've got a certain number of missions and I need a certain percentage of ship availability, like I might need a 1.0 presence mission, right? It takes a ship full time to do this. How many ships do I have to have one forward? So let's go ahead and talk about how you would calculate that. But first, let's do the usual announcements. My schedule continues to be uncertain because of the weather. I am going to try to go to Ohio again next weekend. We'll see how that works. And then if that's the case, the 21st of February, I'll expect to do a show. On the 28th of February, I expect to do a show. And then the 7th of February, I'm not expecting to do a show. Now, you may recall that I said that I had something scheduled for next weekend, and it was sort of contingent upon how that thing worked out. Well, that event got moved to the right, so that's going to be sometime in March, because it involves a friend of mine who just recently had open heart surgery, and he and his wife decided that let's just kick this a week to the March. A month to the right into March. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so the stuff that's in the queue is pretty much the same stuff that was in the queue last time. So I've done some work on some of those projects, actually. Sorry, that was just a reminder to do something that I thought. Take your med. I took it already, and apparently I didn't hit stop. Apparently I hit delay. So it thought I had snoozed it, when in reality I thought I had stopped it. So in any event, so the standard caveats apply. I'm going to present some artwork here. It's intended for critical commentary and educational purposes. Everything is owned by the copyright owner. I am not talking for my employer, any employer past, present, or potentially future. To the best of my knowledge, my employer has no opinion about how many starships you need to keep one deployed forward. I'm going to talk primarily in the context of Star Trek, but not exclusively in the context of Star Trek. At the end, I'll try to sort of, broaden it a little bit, but I'm going to focus on Star Trek because that's sort of where we have the best information. And that's something that I'm pretty sure that everybody here is familiar with. And let's see, what else was I going to say? There was something else I was going to say. I was going to say that even though I'm not speaking for my employer, I did work at the Center for Naval Analysis, and this was one of the things that I learned about at the Center for Naval Analysis. In fact, I went looking for this. Sorry about that. I went looking for a CNA document that had been published when I was there, or right before I got there, that was just fantastic. And it went through the question of how many carriers do you need for the force to have one deployed. It was exactly this topic. And the way the format was, it went in terms of like, okay, is one enough? Well, no, one isn't enough. One isn't enough because you have to do maintenance on it. It has to go back to port. So one isn't enough. Well, is two enough? Well, no, two isn't enough because you've got transit time, you got this, and you got the other thing. Okay, well, is three enough? And it just sort of went through until it got to a number where it's like, yeah, that's enough. That's enough. And if I remember correctly, that answer was 4.5 for carriers. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that might be the case. So here's the agenda. It looks like there's a lot there. Most of the things here are one slide. So it's not as many slides as you might think. I think it's like a total of 15, 16 slides, something like that. And I'll do the standard thing where I go through and do the presentation, and then I'll look for questions. And Lissa will look for questions and pop anything up that I need to see sooner than that. So first, a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk about I spend a lot of time talking about how the U.S. Navy does things currently. And then I'm going to switch over to Star Trek and talk about how Star Trek does things. And then at the end, I've got one slide where I'll just sort of talk a little bit about other science fiction and how you can sort of use the same techniques to think about other science fiction. So first of all, a little bit of an introduction. Let's define the topic a little bit. Why can't you constantly deploy a ship? Well, needs to resupply occasionally. Okay, that makes sense, right? You need to occasionally go home and restock. Spare parts, crew, right? You might need new crew. All sorts of fuel, things like that. You've got to do routine maintenance, some of which is not necessary to be done in a shipyard or at least in a naval base. So there's a lot of stuff that they can do pier side, but they can't really do it at sea. You don't paint the ship at sea, or at least not down by the waterline, right? That's just asking for trouble. You can paint other stuff at sea, but as a general rule, you don't paint at sea. You paint when you're in the yard, when you're in the naval base. There's occasionally you have to do deep maintenance, and by deep maintenance I mean stuff where it's a big deal. You have to have cranes. You have to be able to take deck plating up. You have to be able to get to the reactor core or something like that. In fact, you may recall from some of the stuff that Andy Presby's done. I think we've talked about that in this show. That it's clear that when Probert designed the Enterprise for Star Trek Enterprise, the NX-01, that he was thinking about, how do I get the reactor core out? How do I get the warp core out? And he made provisions for that. And that's why I think if you sort of reject the Franz Joseph blueprint idea and you think that secondary hull of the original series Enterprise has a big warp core in it, I think that warp core comes out through the shuttle bay. But that's the sort of thing that's going to require a real no-shit shipyard, and the ship is offline for months at a time in order to do stuff like that. So all of these things, and there's also this personnel tempo stuff, right? You can't, nobody's going to go and spend their entire life working, right? Especially in the United States Navy, maybe you got a family. Maybe you'd like to see that family every now and then. There was a great thing I saw recently from the late 1960s. It was a sailor requesting special leave, and the justification for the special leave was, my wife intends to get pregnant this weekend. I'd really like to be there when it happens. And so, if you go to sea all the time, if you spend all your time at sea, what ends up happening is people do one tour and then they never come back. That happened when the USS New Jersey did an 18-month deployment back in the 1980s because Beirut blew up, and she was at sea when it happened on a two-week test cruise. They sent her to the Mediterranean and then just rolled her into her cruise, and she was gone for 18 months, and like the entire crew quit. And so for personal tempo reasons, purse tempo reasons, you can't be constantly deployed. So that employs that to have one ship deployed, you need some number of ships that's greater than one. And we're going to look at some of the factors that go into that. And we're going to start off with the US Navy, and then we're going to think about Starfleet. And this is not the how big a fleet is question, right? We're not talking about resources and strategy and all the other stuff that goes along with it. What we are talking about, I'll get to that in just a second, Patrick. That's a great question. What we're talking about here is the idea of if I want to have a ship in a given place, how many ships do I have to do to guarantee that I could put a ship in that place? And I'm assuming what's known as a 1.0 presence. Sometimes you might say, I don't need to have a ship in the Mediterranean all the time. I want to have a ship in the Mediterranean about half the time, right? At points during the Cold War, we had one or two carriers in the Med all the time. But then, when the Cold War went away, we said, okay, half the time is good enough. Half the time is good enough. So Patrick Ross asked the question, how do you have 0.5 of a carrier? And the answer is you don't, in that you can't build 0.5 of a carrier, but when you're counting up how many carriers you need, you can get to 0.5. So how would you get to 0.5, right? Okay, if you need to have if the answer is 4.5 for the total number of carriers to guarantee having a 1.0 presence here, and you've got another 1.0 presence over there, and it's 4.5 for both of those, we'll assume for sake of argument, transit times are roughly the same, et cetera, et cetera. So all different locations are effectively the same. Well, 1 4.5 and 1 4.5 means I need to buy 9 carriers. I don't need to buy 10, I need to buy 9. And it's worth pointing out that this is what we're talking about here is a minimum, right? That doesn't give you a whole lot of reserve unless you build some reserve in. It doesn't give you any sort of like what happens if you blow out a steam turbine? What happens if one of your ships is involved in a collision and has to go in the shipyard or something like that? Depending upon when it happens in the cycle, it might not affect your ability to have ships at sea, but it might affect your ability to have ships at sea. Like if you crash a ship into something else, right, early on in its deployment, and it's now unavailable for its deployment, and it's early on in the deployment, so you don't have anything else ready to go, that can be a problem. So we're talking about sort of the bare minimum to get to there. Okay, so let's see, going on. So let's take a look at U.S. and aircraft carriers, and that's because they're big, complicated ships. They're nuclear powered, so they have reactors. So they're I think they're a lot closer to being something with antimatter than, for instance, a Ticonderoga class cruiser is. And I know a little bit about carrier ops because I've spent some time on aircraft carriers. I was primarily an ASW person. I wasn't an airplane person while I was there. But I know a little bit about these, and these seems to be a reasonable analogy, and it's going to highlight some of the issues that I think are important with this. And so I'll note, this isn't really about being able to calculate how many aircraft carriers we need. It's about understanding the sorts of factors that go into a calculation of that type so that we can then go and talk about important things, starships, and apply those tools to talking about starships. And so I'm making the assumption that it's basically a peacetime deployment. I'm not talking about surging the entire fleet to fight a war. I'll note that when we did that for OEF and OIF, we screwed up the fleet deployment plan for 10 years because they had a nice plan, etc., and it got thrown out the window, including when ships were going to go in the shipyard. And the shipyard time is highly prized, scheduled, highly scheduled, etc., etc. It was a big deal. I don't think the other services truly appreciated what a big deal it was for the Navy to throw out their plan and just wing it. And the Navy paid the price for years on that. And it led them to think about how to do things differently. And I'll mention that a little bit further on. So the caveats here is that we're talking about rough estimates only. We're not actually calculating how many carriers are needed. So I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details. I'm trying to highlight how to think about the problem. So I'm not going to talk about shipyard capacity issues and how, limitations on the shipyard prevent you from scheduling shipyard time. I'm not going to talk about the details of what's known as the fleet response plan. At least that's what it was called back when I was dealing with this stuff. And that is the schedule and how they think about scheduling carriers. So it includes some built-in assumptions. I'm not going to get into all the details of that because I don't think that that's relevant here. I'm not going to do the calculations on travel time. Not going to talk about, about the various Navy hubs. And I'm going to largely ignore the forward deployed naval force. So the FDNF, I think we've got an FDNF hub in Australia in addition to an FDNF hub in Yokosuka, Japan, which is the one that's been around forever and ever and ever. That carrier is home ported in Yokosuka. And so it goes to the local shipyard in Yokosuka, and it follows a totally different schedule. And so basically it goes into the shipyard in Yokosuka for like 2 months out of the year, 6 weeks out of the year, every year. And it's always deployed, even counts as deployed even when it's in its home port. And it just surges out and back as need be. And as a general rule, it doesn't go to sea for 6 months at a time. It goes to sea for 3 weeks, and then it goes back to port. And then it goes to sea for 2 weeks, and then it comes back to port, and then it goes to sea for a week. And it's just sort of constantly doing stuff. By and large, it doesn't change the average at all. It operates a little differently, but all the numbers kind of add up in the same way, even though they're apportioned differently. So I'm not going to get into the details of that because I don't think that that's necessarily a good model for what Starfleet's going on. So we're just going to hand wave that away. Okay, so let's talk about what the Navy's trying to accomplish. What's its goals and the sort of factors that affect carrier availability. So basically the Navy's trying to balance 3 things, and it's a zero-sum game. If you you can rob Peter to pay Paul, but you're robbing Peter to do that. They want to deploy carriers and generate forward presence. They want to be in a location, being the cop on the beat, that's presence. So they want to have like a 1.0 presence in a particular location. That might be the Indian Ocean. It might be Westpac. It might be the Atlantic. Who knows? So you want to deploy carriers and generate presence. You want to have some reserve. This is very much a response to post 9/11 when they screwed up their deployment plan. They said, yeah, let's think about having some reserve. And under the old plan, they didn't really have a reserve, because what would happen is carrier goes to sea, it goes and does its thing, it's deployed, they're practicing every day, they're living the dream, they're doing the on-site stuff. They are rocking and rolling. They are at the peak of their game. And then they come home, and within a month, they're combat ineffective. So why is that? Well, some of it's that a lot of the skills on a carrier are highly perishable. Like the air wing, for instance, landing on an aircraft carrier is a big deal. you have to practice that like every day, every other day. And if you don't practice it every day, you get rusty. And at some point, you're no longer certified to do that. But I'm not even talking about the air wing. I'm talking about the ship itself and the battle group itself. And the reason why you go combat ineffective so quickly is not just that you're not practicing, although that's a big deal, but you go home and what happens? You move to another billet. Right? That's when you do PCSing. That's when you go off to your new ship. You go off to a school because you're getting promoted and you've got additional duties and stuff like that. And so what ends up happening is you very quickly get to the point where a lot of people are just gone and their billets are gapped until the new guy arrives, because the new guy might be in a school. He's not there yet. The guys that are there haven't practiced in a while. And a lot of them are in a different job than they were before. Oh, and there's a whole bunch of new guys too who haven't yet learned how to work together. And so if you've got a unit that's doing very dangerous flight deck stuff and 50% of your guys are new and have never worked on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier before, you are not ready to go do combat operations. So that's the way it used to work. And then after 9/11, they realized, we should rethink this. And so the fleet response plan they came up with, and then they later did something called, I think it was the optimized fleet response plan, after they sort of had some lessons learned that they could put into the system. The idea was, okay, we're going to hold off moving everybody around. We're going to make them sit in place. We'll let them go on leave, but they're on a tether, right? So nobody's taking 6 weeks off. Can have the weekend off, can have a week off. But if we shoot up a flare, if we put up the bat signal, you're going back to sea. And so they would keep ships in a ready reserve status for a month or two to sort of, like, they had it orchestrated in such a way that they were trying to cover with various carriers in various different places. And so they set it up in such a way that they would have some combat capability they could send to sea. So that's what they mean there by having surge-ready carriers available. So that would be a surge-ready carrier, capable carrier. If you're not ready to go to sea, you're not surge-ready. And then the final goal they must balance is maintaining the material condition of the ship, because, man, they beat these ships hard. They work them hard. They work them hard, and they work them 24/7. And they need to do some maintenance. And there's a lot of stuff they can't do at sea. There's a lot of stuff that they could do at sea if they weren't busy training and preparing to fight the nation's wars. And so as a result of that, they come back. And there's all sorts of stuff they have to do pure side, all sorts of stuff they have to fix, and resurface the flight deck, et cetera, et cetera. And then they always go into the shipyard and they spend some time in the shipyard, and they spend some time working on the hull, and they make sure everything's painted, because painting is protection, right? Painting is not just making it look nice. Painting is preventing corrosion, et cetera, et cetera. And oh, by the way, there are a few things on Earth that are more corrosive than salt water. And so you have to do all these things to maintain the condition of the ship. And if you're busy being deployed, you're not maintaining the condition of the ship. You can tell that the U.S. Navy right now is being rode hard and put away wet, but just you look at any picture of the ship and you see rust everywhere. That's an indication of a ship that of a force that is not having the time necessary to do the maintenance that it needs to meet the material condition of the ship. They will pay for that in the long run, and sometimes in the short run. You end up in a situation where you need a ship and it's not available because all the issues have cascaded, and because you didn't fix something when it was small, it's now a big problem, and the force falls apart. One of the things I like about David Weber's Honor Harrington series is that David understands things like that, and there's an explicit conversation in one of the books where the admiral in charge of the fleet says, "Sir, we can do that, but you're going to pay the price in about 6 months." If we don't rotate ships through in about 6 months, we're going to have to pull them offline because we're going to start losing FTL nodes. We're going to start losing nodes on the drive because when they get old, they risk blowing up, and so we're going to have to pull the ships off. So what factors affect carrier availability, right? You got this trade-off, but what do you need to do what affects the actual availability? Well, first of all, you got to train people. There's the length of training. There's the amount of level of readiness. Are they ready to deploy? Have they spent time together, working together? Like when a carrier battle group or a carrier strike group is working up, there's a series of certifications that they do, and they start with, can all the guys in the department do the job? Okay, so all the guys in all the departments across the ship can do the job. Can they interact with each other and do the job? Okay, can they go to sea in this ship and operate the ship just by itself? Okay, then can they go to sea with other ships and coordinate with other ships and do the job? And at every step along the way, there's a certification process. They're evaluated. Okay, you are certified for independent ops. You are certified for deep water operations. You are certified for carrier strike group ops. I was actually part of that process. I would go to sea with them as part of their joint task force exercise, which was their final certification exercise before they deployed. And so that was the one where they got certified to go forth and do the job. And so you've got that process takes time. The training process takes time. The maintenance process takes time. And then when you're deployed, that takes time. So the length of those cycles, you add all that stuff in to figure out what the carrier availability looks like. And it also, there's different types of maintenance. Sometimes you're going into the yard and you just need to do a little bit of work on the hull. Other times you're going into the yard and you're ripping things out. Like an aircraft carrier, with the Nimitz class, every 20 years, they have to go in to have the reactors record. And that was 5 years in the shipyard. 5 years. And then there's just timing of real world events and timing of when the shipyard's available, right? So, hey, we'd like to go into the shipyard, but these guys are blocking one of the slipways because they're undergoing their 5-year overhaul. There's always somebody undergoing their 5-year overhaul, basically. And so you gotta juxtapose all that stuff. So those are the sorts of goals and factors that figure into it. So, all right, how do you think about classifying whether they're available or not? Okay, I would argue this is based in some part on this 2008 RAND Corporation document, Aircraft Carrier Maintenance Cycles and Their Effects, which in turn is part of like a 3-page summary of a much larger report. But I sort of process this and I add a little bit of detail to it. So it's not just me copying the RAND Corporation for this. So I would argue that you've got the following availability states. First of all, you can be deployed. And that means you can be on station doing the mission. So if you need a 1.0 presence and you're deployed, you're doing the mission. You could also be deployed, but you're in transit. You're either heading on stay or you're coming off stay, on station or off station. And that may or may not count towards the mission. It depends on how you think about it. The Navy will decide whether that's the case. Like if your station is Western Pacific and you want to have a 1.0 presence within, say, 500 miles of Japan, and you're off the coast of California, you probably don't count. But, you might swing through the Suez Canal and go to the East Coast. And, maybe you're busy checking the box about maintaining a 0.25 presence in the Med or the Persian Gulf or something like that. So sometimes when you're transiting, you're actually checking a box by going through a particular area. So you can be undeployed. And if you're undeployed, you can either be deployable or undeployable. If you're undeployable, it means you're at the wrong part of your training cycle or the wrong part of your maintenance cycle, right? Maybe you're in the shipyard with the ship all ripped up and your propellers are off because your propellers are being reconditioned or something like that, or you need new ones or something like that. Maybe they're recoring the reactor. Maybe you're having a major systems upgrade because you had a steam turbine problem and they're having to rip everything out to get to the steam turbine. Maybe you just came out of the shipyard and you're at the point where the crew doesn't know how to tie their own shoes yet. And so they're just not ready to be deployable because they would be a danger to themselves and others. That's not intended as a slam. That's true with anybody else, right? Like it's a complicated, dangerous job. And you can't just pick it up and do it, especially because like most of the people on board the ship are 19 years old. And, in a lot of cases, this is the first real job they've ever had, and they need to be trained to do the job right. And so if they're not trained, you can't go to sea with them yet. Alternatively, you could be deployable. And maybe it's planned that you're deployable. You're the surge ship. You're the ready ship. USS Carl Vinson, you are to maintain your surge deployability. So that means there's restrictions on how many people you can have off the ship and this and that and the other thing. I don't know all the details of that stuff. I never got into that part of it. But it means that you've got some restrictions because you're the ready carrier. And sometimes you end up doing things like going to sea because the ready air group, which is if you're a pilot and you haven't been to sea in a while, you go to the ready air group, and it's basically you fly with training wheels for a while, and then you get to the point where you're ready to deploy again. But they have to get you back up to speed because you could kill a lot of people when you crash that airplane into the ship, and they'd prefer that you not do that. And so they try to get you back up to speed, and they send you to this special squadron called the Ready Air Group. Well, at some point you need an aircraft carrier to go with the Ready Air Group, and they're not assigned to a carrier; they're assigned to a ground base. So every now and then a carrier has to go to sea. And this actually is one of these things where everything is in alignment, because if you're the ready carrier, if you're the surge carrier, then, hey, let's use them. They're available. They need to keep their skills up too. Let's use them. Sometimes a carrier that gets back will get sent to sea to be the surge ship. I know of at least one instance where John C. Stennis was supposed to be the ready carrier to go play with the RAG. And she was leaving San Diego, and she got a little bit out of the channel and got into sort of shallow water and didn't run aground, but she did get close enough that she sucked a bunch of mud up into her seawater intakes. And so they shut everything down and they went back to port. And Carl Vinson, that had just got back, was told, you need to go to sea to be the ready carrier for the Ready Air Group. And they weren't happy. And I know about this because a friend of mine was on Carl Vinson, and he was bad-mouthing Stennis about how, Stennis kept screwing up, and this is the latest thing they did, et cetera, et cetera. He and I had been on board Stennis together. My very first trip at sea and my very last trip at sea were aboard John C. Stennis. I'm sorry, my last trip at sea on a carrier was aboard John C. Stennis. And so that's a ship I'm familiar with. And so let's see. So you can be the surge carrier. You can be unplanned. And so that means that you're at a point in your training maintenance cycle where you just coincidentally, you could be deployed. You might have to speed up your training. It doesn't necessarily mean you can deploy tomorrow, but it might mean that you can deploy in 3 weeks or a month or 6 weeks or something like that. But you can deploy ahead of schedule. Or maybe you're doing some other mission and you're deployable because you're doing some other mission. And in this particular case, I'm thinking maybe they're just keeping you around to be the ready carrier or something like that. Or, they need a carrier for photo ops or something like that. Or they're holding you in place because you're going to go off and do rim pack or something like that. And so you're sort of out of cycle because you're getting ready to go do something like that. So you can be deployable because you're in that situation. Now, everything on this slide, everything in the previous slide applies to Starfleet as well. You can easily imagine that all the words I used here, if you took out carrier, put in starship, most of it works. Okay, so circa 2008, they were on a 32-month cycle. The assumptions were that you deployed for about 6 months. That seems optimistic to me because I think around 2008, they were deploying a lot longer than 6 months, like 8 months. You would theoretically be in maintenance for about 6 months. Because this was after 9/11, when training for deployment is complete, the carrier can surge within 30 days. And when undergoing basic training after maintenance, the carrier can surge within 90 days. And so that's kind of what the default assumption was based upon what the training plans were at the time. And so for a 32-month cycle, you were deployed about 90% of the time. Now, the assumption is 6 months. I don't think the numbers here include transit and on-stay or off-stay. Depot maintenance is 24%. Now, note, they're both assuming 6 months, but the percentages are different. The numbers don't add up, obviously. I think what we're talking about is we've got a set of assumptions, and then we've got real-world data. And so this is based from the RAND report, and I think this is based upon the real-world data. And about 46%, almost half the time, the way it was set up is that you could be surged in 30 days. And the Navy had to move heaven and earth to sort of set this up like this, but this worked. And I'll note, this is just for like one cycle. This doesn't assume like the full 5 or 20-year cycle. We're going to get into that in the next slide because it doesn't include things like every 20 years you lose the ship from the fleet for 5 years because you have to tear the entire ship apart to get to the reactors and recore the reactors. So it doesn't include things like that. So here's a notional longer term cycle that is, I kind of did this from memory. I did not spend a lot of time going down and tracking down the specifics of this, that, and the other thing because there's a lot of minutia in there. It's changed a lot over time. And really, I'm just trying to illustrate the sort of things you need to think about. This isn't really a talk about aircraft carriers. This is a talk about starships. And so I didn't want to get into the minutia of it. But back when I was kind of going to sea before 9/11, it was kind of a notional cycle based upon about a 20-month cycle. It was like 18 or 20 months. And I'm calling this a minor cycle. And so you deploy from about 6 to 8 months, including transit time, more or less. They tried to keep it down lower, but you know, if you got fewer carriers, it ends up being higher. You worked up for about 6 months, and you spent about 6 months in the shipyard. And so let's talk about a notional cycle where one cycle is 20 months long. 8, 6, and 6. And every third cycle, instead of going into the shipyard for 6 months, you go into the shipyard for a year. And they do bigger things then. And then every 12th cycle, you go in for 5 years, for 60 months. And so that's what this looks like here, right? So you end up with, over the course of 308 months, you end up in the shipyard 4 times. 4 times, or is that 5 times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 3 of the times are for 6 months. 1 of the time is for 12 months. No, it should be more than that. 2 of the times are for 12 months. I'm sorry, you end up in the shipyard 12 times. A bunch of the times are for 12 months. And then most of them are for 6, and then you end up for basically 5 years to do the complex stuff. So that's interesting, right? So that you end up with sort of like this 5-year cycle. Does that sound familiar? I think it does. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing going on in Star Trek. Okay, so let's talk about this 5-year mission. So the premise here, I think, is that Starfleet is following a similar, but not identical, obviously, rotation because they have a similar, but not identical set of requirements. And the 5-year mission of the original series sort of fits within this assumption. Starfleet largely has the same goals, factors, and availability states as the USN. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's a little bit different. The model kind of transfers across these domains. There's clearly differences in the operational environment, right? You're not putting starships within a substance that's trying to dissolve them. And there's differences in material science, et cetera, et cetera. The 5-year mission, though, in my mind, suggests 2 things. One is that Starfleet lives on on-the-job training and certification, right? Because U.S. Navy goes to sea for 6 or 8 months and then it comes back and then people go off to schools, et cetera, et cetera. If you're gone for 5 years and that's your standard deployment, now maybe they're doing personnel transfers in the middle of it, but I don't think so. I think the idea is that you're on board that ship for 5 years as sort of a default. The default assumption is that you're on board the ship for 5 years, which means you have to be able to do a lot of training and certification on board the ship. A lot of it's going to be on-the-job training. A lot of it is going to be computer-based training, et cetera, et cetera. We see, I think, more of that in terms of next gen, but I think that was true going all the way back to the original series. And the other thing is that I'm going to assert that I think the main driver is antimatter refueling. Because if we look at least the numbers from next gen, 5 years seems to be about the amount of time when you might be thinking that you need to go stock up on antimatter. And so, like, hey, we've used a big chunk of our antimatter, so we can suck what's left out, and we can do all the maintenance we need to do, all the big picture maintenance we need to do. I'd start with the system that contains the antimatter. That's where I'd start. And then you're ready to rock and roll. Okay, so let's take a look at the goals and factors of Starfleet deployment. So reminder, we're talking about a couple of centuries worth of time period. If we talk about Enterprise and Deep Space Nine, that's a long period of time. So things change. I'm painting with a broad brush. I would argue that Starfleet's trying to deploy starships to generate forward presence and to do exploration. It's not just about presence. You can think of the exploration in terms of presence, but I kind of like the idea that they've got a defensive mission and they've also got this exploration mission, because I've previously argued that I think they designed different ships for that. And so they optimize for different things. Although they're all armed, they can all participate in the defense mission. A lot of it has to do with deflectors and navigational deflectors and how fast the ship is and things like that. So the other goals are pretty much the same. And I think that they've got the added attributes affecting starship availability of really long transit times potentially away from Starfleet facilities. If there isn't a starbase nearby that has a major shipyard, they may have to travel a long distance to get back to a place where they can have some serious work done. And they may have to travel a long distance to get to a place where there's some schools for their crew. And so when you start thinking about that, I think they're a long ways away. The Federation, from a time perspective, is a lot bigger than Earth is. So I would say that the availability states are pretty much the same. So they kind of look the same to me. There's a few important differences in how to think about this. One is that Starfleet has modular ships. They're kind of designed to be upgraded in the shipyard. I'm going to talk a little bit more about modularity in the real world and implications of that, because there's some new stuff that's come out recently on that, both some doctrine documents from the Royal Navy and the ever clever Danes have yet another system that is designed to provide modular capabilities to warships. But Starfleet's all over that modular capability for warships thing. They have synthesizers to begin with and later replicators. So things like food synthesizers and other sorts of things mean that, like for instance, I don't need to go back to get food. I just need to find a comet or something. Or, I just need to find some organic matter and I can process it into food. I just need to find some materials and I can process it into a bunch of spare parts and things like that. It gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of being out there, because like when the U.S. Navy goes to sea, it's constantly being resupplied. A couple of times a week, they link up and they take on supplies and stuff like that. Whereas Kirk is alone and unafraid. And you see Picard getting mail from home, getting passengers from home, but he's not getting a whole lot of material support from home. You've got computer maintenance routines that can tell you exactly when you're having a problem and fix problems themselves. So I think a lot of this is software controlled stuff, and you can just fix the software and have the software fix things. They've got a lot better material science than we do. There's no salt water anywhere in this process, which is, trust me, that's a good thing. But the real big difference, I think, or one of the real big differences is they've got antimatter as their fuel, which means they don't have to refuel on a regular basis. But when they run out of fuel, antimatter is not something you just pull up to the nearest refinery and say, give me some antimatter. In fact, Sternbach and Okuda in the Next Gen Tech Manual talk about how refueling operations are sort of complicated in part because antimatter is very vulnerable or very valuable. And as a result, it's considered the sort of thing that pirates might go after or somebody might raid, which is interesting. There are pirates in the Federation, within the Federation borders. Okay, roger that. So I think, my guess is that when they need to refuel antimatter, they're not doing that in the wild. They're probably going back to a significant base. So I think antimatter may be the big factor driving deployment cycles. It's basically the only time the ship has to return is actually at the end of its mission. And a large chunk of that is they're running low on antimatter. So let's look at the example of Star Trek, the motion picture. This is a radical overhaul after Kirk's 5-year mission. So what do we think that this cycle looks like? I think it looks like the following. Robert April goes off on a 5-year mission and comes back, and they do a year's worth of refit and work up, and they get a new crew, everybody moves along, et cetera, et cetera. They do the antimatter refueling, and then they do the workup, and they pull back together, and they learn how to be a ship's crew again, and then they deploy for 5 years under Christopher Pike. And so he's gone for 5 years, 5-year mission, plus a year of refit and workup with antimatter refuel and all the rest of it. And he does all the refit stuff at the end for about a year, and then James Kirk takes over. And he does a 5-year mission. But I think James Kirk's ship had a deep overhaul, which, if you think about it, makes sense. April was gone for 5 years plus 1. Pike was gone for 5 years plus 1. Kirk does a 5-year mission. It's 17 years without this ship having the major overhaul. Now, there's all sorts of speculation about, that this was some weird thing, and there's all sorts of, everybody has their own non-canon explanation as to exactly what was going on. But I think, actually, whether this engineering refit is the thing that you would expect, I don't know, this level of engineering refit, but I think the idea is they do a major overhaul every 3rd mission. That would be about the right time frame for that. And that they're thinking about stuff like that because Sternbach and Okuda said that that's one of the reasons why the bridge is on top, is because it's a module that can just be popped out and replaced. It wouldn't surprise me if every time you do a 5-year mission, when you come back, one of the things they do in that year refit is they pop the bridge module out and put a new one in. I think that that's probably one of the things that happens. So, all right, so let's take a look at Next Gen. The Galaxy class famously had families aboard. Why would you do that? I mean, a lot of people have said this is really dumb that they had families on board. I don't think it's dumb at all. I think it solves an important Starfleet deployment problem, which is the problem of convincing a bunch of people to leave for 5 years and leave their families behind. Take your family with you. I mean, the U.S. Navy has a problem with deployments being, I said 8 to 9 years. I meant to say 8 to 9 months. 8 to 9 months is a huge disincentive. And so what do you think a 5-year deployment is going to do to that? How many people do you think are going to sign up for that? I mean, I would, but I'm crazy. A bunch of people watching this would, but we're all crazy. You wouldn't be here on a Saturday night listening to me if you weren't crazy at some level. So that's a compliment, by the way. So the solution is you bring your families along. You create your own little small town environment, and you go do the thing. and you got everything you need there, right? You got families, you got the whole bit. So I think this says a lot about the operational environment of 24th century Starfleet, that they thought that this is the right answer. This says that they're primarily considering themselves an exploration force, which makes a lot of sense. Klingon problems gone away. All the sort of ramp up Cold War militarism of the original series and the movie era. Klingons aren't a problem anymore, and the Romulans have decided to go hide behind the neutral zone. The Starfleet's just, you got to deal with like second-rate powers like the Cardassians, but they're primarily an exploration force, and the idea of bringing families along solves a big problem, big personnel problem. And then they discover the Borg, and then the situation goes to shit, and they end up fighting the war with Deep Space Nine, et cetera, and eventually, well, you look at the Sovereign class, there's no families on board. Boy, that situation is really degraded. It's a much different universe for Starfleet at the time when the Sovereign class is designed and executed than it was when the Galaxy class was designed and executed. Their default assumptions and requirements are different. I'm going to do a show on how do you think about the requirements process at some point. But this is part of the deal, is that you've got this requirement, and the requirement changed. I'm confident of that. Okay, so what about other science fiction? I thought about leading off with this slide. This is the how to build a Navy slide. You've seen it before. You'll probably see it again because I should probably go back and revisit the topic. The way you read it is you start off with the strategic stuff on the left-hand side, and by the time you get to the right-hand side, you're deciding, what kind of stapler they need to have. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but my point in this slide is that the stuff in red in the middle is the only thing that science fiction authors generally think about. There are a few exceptions. David Weber thinks about some of the other stuff, or at least he knows his background well enough that when you ask him questions about it, he immediately understands the importance of why you would be asking that question. And he can give you an answer, and his answer is nuanced enough that he says, well, the People's Republic of Haven does it this way, but the Manticorans do it this other way. Because he understands how they think in their head. But a lot of this stuff boils down to things like, what's the shore establishment look like, and how do you forward deploy or not? And so if you're thinking about other science fiction, those are important things. Am I forward deployed, or am I a garrison force? When I go out to sea, like in the interwar period, U.S. Navy was at sea all the time. Supposedly we are isolations, but the Navy went to sea all the time. It's just we didn't go on patrol. We didn't go to like the Persian Gulf and hang out. We go to sea for a month and then we come back. Go to sea for 2 weeks and then we come back. Sometimes we go to sea for 2 months and come back. We're kind of like the forward deployed naval force in Japan, except we were deployed out of San Diego and Norfolk and places like that, and then later moved the fleet to Hawaii and sort of did the same thing out of Hawaii. And so that's how we did it back then. And so if you're doing it in whatever other science fiction, maybe that's how you do it. A lot of this depends upon technology assumptions too, in terms of how many ships you need forward. Like if it takes me a long period of time to get any significant distance, I need more ships, right? If I'm deploying from Earth and I have to go out relatively slowly to a jump point and jump to another system and then cross the system to get to a jump point and then jump to another system, and everything's coming from Earth, all that stuff can take time. If you go and read the Weber and White Starfire series, it takes them forever to get a message across. If you look at Traveler, it takes like a year to get word in from the periphery if you're just going the regular jump network. If you're doing X-boats, you can do it faster, but that's specifically designed to do it faster, but it still takes forever. It's like the Emperor only finds out that he's at war, that the Imperium is at war after the war is over, although he doesn't know the war is over. He just gets this notice that says, yeah, 6 months ago there was a war that started. We're fighting a war. And, the war lasted 5 months. And so in another 6 months, he'll get word that the war is over. Or another 5 months, he'll get word that the war is over. So the technology assumptions always play into things like this. How borders work always play into this, et cetera, et cetera. But you also need to think about all the different inputs that are on the slide. Because all of these things affect how you approach that problem. Like if you base everything remotely, like if we didn't base our forces on the continental United States, we based everything overseas, that changes the answer some. Likewise, if I'm not going to go on patrol, like if I don't have I want to have a 1.0 presence in the Western Pacific, who cares? I don't need to have a carrier to go there. You might get to the point where you just say, how many carriers do I need to fight and win the war? It might be the answer 6. I just need to keep them ready. And I can probably keep them ready if I'm not beating them to death all the time, and I can run them into the shipyard for a week or 2 instead of everything being like once every 4 years, or once every 18 months I get to go in the shipyard for 6 months, right? If I can just sort of cycle them through faster, that might work out for everybody. They're dealing with small problems rather than big problems. So all right, so I think it's time to take a look at some questions here. Let me go through a second. Let's make the mouse work. Hello, everybody. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, Bob points out 5-year mission is probably the original dream of how long the show would last when it was launched. So that works. They thought bigger in Next Gen because it says the continuing mission. Maybe that's an indication they got the families on board, and so they don't need to think about that rotation, and maybe that means they've got antimatter refueling facilities closer to the front. Okay, you know what? Let me close that and do that. All right, so scrolling. Looks like Wright says it's 32 degrees. He's in Florida. It's 32 degrees in Florida. So oh, Bob says he broke his leg. Bob, when did you break your leg? Did I miss that? Maybe I missed that. Okay, Wright says something about Wonderfest. I'm gonna write that down. Because we've talked about Wonderfest in the past, and my schedule is sort of, I've got some stuff going on right before that, and so I may reward myself for successfully completing the 2 projects I have due in May. So Dustin spends a little bit of time here talking about different mixes and stuff. And so let me point out that Alexander Clark, Dr. Alex Clark, who does naval history stuff, he actually, it turns out he came out with something like yesterday on a topic pretty close to this. It was actually real world, but how many ships you need, etc. And as a general rule, I like his stuff. I think that the biggest criticism I have is I think his stuff is too long. I think that, he'll do cram pack a 60-minute show into 90 minutes. But in this particular case, he said a lot of things that were really good, but he also said a lot of things that were just plain wrong. And like one of them was he was talking about the carrier strike group versus carrier battle group, and seemed to imply that it was just a change in terminology. It's not. Carrier strike group has fewer ships in it than a carrier battle group does. And so a carrier strike group only has generally like one cruiser and 2 destroyers, maybe 3 destroyers, and then a supply ship of some sort. That's the order of magnitude. A little bit more, a little bit less, et cetera, et cetera. It does not generally have a whole lot of other stuff with it. There was somebody else I saw who did, I'm trying to remember who it was on YouTube, who did something where he was trying to calculate the tonnage of a group, and he made the assumption there were 2 submarines in every carrier battle group. They're on paper at one point, and that point was in the 1990s. On paper, there was 2 submarines in a carrier battle group, but in practice, they didn't actually deploy that way because submarines were what they call low-density, high-value units, and they always got sent off for other tasking. So for a while, they maintained this fiction. They'd all sort of like cross over the line together, but once they got in theater and the local commander had them, they said, okay, submarines, you go here. Rest of you go here. There was also some talk about, ships not being able to defend the carrier. Like they're way over there. Why are they way over? Well, because we're not at war, is the short answer. And the carrier and its strike group is a set of resources available to the local combatant commander to do things with. And so, the destroyer can't defend the carrier if it's overdoing that other op, but the commander made the decision that other op was important enough to send them over there. So they were given orders that said, detach USS Umpty Frats, go do this other thing. Like it might be maritime intercept operations, enforcing the embargo against, pick a random country. And so the end result of that is this isn't an indication the system failed. It's actually an indication the system is working exactly like it's planned, because it means that there's enough excess capacity that you can still maintain plane guard. You can still have plane guard and one other ship that you can put down the threat axis, and you've got extra resources that you can go do stuff. Does that mean that everybody's happy with the number of resources they have? No. You would like to have more resources, but it's also the case that if the balloon went up, the first thing that would happen is that ship that's overdoing maritime intercept operations would be told, get your butt back to the carrier, we're at war. And the MEO ops are no longer important. You need to come back. So it's important to keep that sort of stuff in mind. A battle group, the Navy does not expect a strike group to be able to have the same level of capability that a battle group does. It's smaller, it has fewer units. The units have gotten better, and Arleigh Burke is better than Espruance. However, they are not, you've only got a certain number of them. And so the Navy's thinking is that you could disaggregate them a little bit easier, because there's smaller groups and you can build them up when you need to. So when you need to go fight a war, you send 2 carrier strike groups, or you create a battle group by sending some extra escorts. The other ships are easier to sort of surge off in that situation than carriers are. So that's what's going on with that. Olive says some things make more sense in space than on water. Yep. Yeah, Wright says he felt that both Nimitz and Ike have some oomph left in their control rods and would maybe keep them both in ready reserve. I've never pulled the thread on what would be involved with that. I know that they're going to have crew on board for a long, long time. Enterprise, until she actually went to the yard, I know somebody who visited Enterprise like 2 years after she was decommissioned, and there are people all over it because it's got working nuclear reactors. And you've also got things like, according to maritime law, you have to have a master on board. A. Bertram Chandler, a famous science fiction author, was a merchant mariner, and his last at sea, quote at sea, his last merchant marine assignment before he fully retired from that was he was the master of the Australian aircraft carrier, which was pierside, and she was going to be scrapped, But according to maritime law, she needed to have a master on board. And so they paid him to live on the ship for 2 years. So he lived on the ship and wrote science fiction novels. What a fantastic job. Can I get that job? I'd love that job. I'm not qualified to be a ship's master. Randall Wong points out, with enough age, ships fall apart whether the power plant lasts or not. Yeah, that's what's really going on with the Tychos. So Tychos have multiple issues. One is that hull was, there was more ship than that hull was really designed for. That was a Spruance hull. They put a lot more weight on that hull, and it was a hull that's taken a real beating. All of the gear is old because the ships are old. So yeah, okay, it's still got LM 2500s, but they're 25, 30, 35. See, those ships were coming out in the 80s. So you got, in some cases, you've got gas turbines that are almost 40 years old. And so, yeah, even if the hull was in great material condition, I probably have to replace all the engines. And that's non-trivial. I think you can get them in and out through the stacks, if I remember correctly. I think they are designed to be removable. But that doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's cheap. And there's all sorts of other issues with that. So they're older systems, and those ships were rode hard and put away wet. So Bob points out Federation lifespan is much longer, so taking 5 years off to go do stuff, not as big a percentage as today. Yeah, and that's a good point. In fact, I thought that they missed the ball with Picard. Instead of saying it was 20 years in the future or 30 years or whatever it was, they should have said it's 70 years in the future. And everybody looks like they're 30 years older, but they're actually 70 years older, because people just live to be like 250 in that universe. That's the way they should have done it. But they did not. So Wright points out that he did 4 years on the USS Austin. You didn't do 4 years at sea. You spent a lot of time in port. You spent a lot of time able to go visit friends, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, but that's a good point. You could have a 5-year tour. You could be ship's company for 5 years, but it's a little bit different when you say like if you're aboard the Enterprise from Next Gen. I'm sorry, not Next Gen. From the original series, I believe the crew was 423 people. So you're going to go spend the next 5 years with those 423 people. I hope you like those people, because if you don't, it's going to suck. And then you're probably never going to see those people again. Okay. So Cosmo Flanker says, does a 5-year mission mean you're gone for 5 years, or you're just aboard the ship for 5 years? And I interpret it as being that you're kind of gone for 5 years. I think you're deployed for 5 years. Now, maybe you come back to star bases every now and then, and maybe you rotate some crew out, et cetera, et cetera. But I think Kirk was expecting that he was going to be captain of that ship for 5 years. And I think that the expectation was they were going to be out in the Federation exploration area exploring for 5 years. Yes, there probably is saltwater and cetacean ops, but it's on the inside. They've got force fields. So there are Orion pirates. Yeah, so Olive says they weren't for the Galaxy class. They weren't putting families on a battleship. They didn't view it as being a battleship. I think it was an explorer. And so I think the Federation or the Starfleet has this weird mandate where they do exploration, they do diplomatic stuff, and they do all this other stuff. And they also happen to be the Federation's defense force. So I think their idea is that if they possibly can get away with it, they put phasers on everything. And if you're an explorer, a lot of the attributes that make you useful as an explorer would also make you useful as a warship. So we're going to go ahead and put some weapons on, because you're already going to need to have the deflector. You're already going to need to have the high speed. You're already going to need to have the good shielding. You already need those things. So we're just going to go ahead and put some weapons on. And that way, and you might occasionally need the weapons, but the important thing is that if the balloon goes up, you get new orders. And basically you push the big red button that says convert the warship mode, and you load all the warship software and you go be a warship. Wright says he's really looking forward to the requirements episode. So am I, for what it's worth. And he also talked about U.S. Naval Institute Press. I actually haven't seen that YouTube channel. I need to go looking for it. Okay, Bob says he broke his leg back on December 21st. Maybe I do remember that. In any event, Bob, I hope you get well soon. So that's an interesting idea. Starfleet could take off the saucer and the cells and put them on a refurbished engineering section to speed up the turnaround. Maybe? That's an interesting question. How modular are they? We know from the Next Gen Technical Manual that when they were building Enterprise, they swapped the warp coils between two of the ships, and it was a better fit for both. And that line jumped out at me, because what do you mean it worked better for both? Aren't they the same? Apparently they're not. Apparently there's some subtle differences there. So that in turn implies to me that there's some calibration issues, et cetera, that you might have to deal with. And that in turn makes me wonder if it actually is the case that you can just pop stuff off like that. I don't know. There's also this interesting thing where, like, okay, you're off, you're alone and unafraid. Presumably you're doing software upgrades and stuff like that because you run into a problem, and so you kind of fix it yourself. And maybe you get a patch from Starfleet Cyber, maybe not. Maybe you have to do your own. I mean, Scotty was constantly making modifications to that chip. It's probably easier in the Federation than it would be here, because you've got a computer system that's automatically doing all these diagnostics and automatically logging all this stuff. And like, I think that basically when you go up to a piece of gear and you run your tricorder over it, it talks to the piece of gear, and the piece of gear tells you the last time maintenance was done on it. And the piece of gear tells you what patches it's running, et cetera, and how it's configured. So maybe even in a universe where everything is sort of being upgraded and updated and modified on its own schedule, maybe even in that world, you could do plug and play between various components. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I love that question. Nuclear vessels. I never understood nuclear vessels. I had Russian as an undergrad. Now, in all fairness, I always say, whenever anybody asks me if I speak Russian, I say, I can give you the names of 4 professors who will tell you no. But Russian has a V. Sovietsky. It's got a V. Why is he saying vessels? That doesn't make any sense to me. I've got a friend who's a native Russian speaker, and I keep forgetting to ask her that. Happy birthday, Patrick. Happy birthday. So Dustin points out something that happened in Picard season 3 about moving ship parts around. I will admit I haven't seen Picard season 3, so I can't comment on that particular thing. it is an interesting idea. In Sternbach and Okuda clearly think in those terms. And I've made the argument in the past that, basically with each new generation, Starfleet designs a ship that's made out of modular components that it can then use to build other ships. And we see that with the Nebula, right? They build the Galaxy class, the Galaxy sort of checks a certain set of boxes, and then they build the Nebula. They did the same thing with the Miranda, but unlike the Miranda and the other ships that sort of came from that lineage, the Nebula class actually has a deflector. It actually has a real secondary hull. And so I think the Nebula does not suffer from some of the limitations that I would argue the Miranda does compared to the Enterprise. Now, the Miranda has some other things going for it. Like the Miranda actually has a greater internal volume. It's clearly got more shuttle space, and I would argue it's probably way better armed. But I don't think it's as fast. I don't think it's designed to be an explorer. I think it's designed to be a behind the lines and second line survey vessel, right? It's not exploration, it's survey. They found a place, let's go take a look at it. And I also think that it's that one of its other jobs is when the Klingons come calling to clean their clock. Because I think during that time period, it was a time of a Cold War, a burgeoning Cold War, and Starfleet was expecting that it was going to have to put on its Navy hat any day now. And so they were prepping for the war that they saw coming, that in the end never came, but they were ready for it. And that's why we have the Excelsior, and that's why we have the Miranda. And that's why they built a metric shit ton of them. And that's why we keep seeing them for decades after that, because it was easier just to keep the lines hot, and they just kept upgrading them. And the ones that came out at the end had entirely new systems. And yes, I am very familiar with the real reason, which is that they had Excelsior models and Miranda models in the special effects department. But I can still tell the story based upon my knowledge of how the real world works and how real navies work. I can tell the story to explain what's on screen without having to use the vulgar explanation of it happened to be the number of models that they had. So let's see. That brings me to the end. And so with that in mind, I think it's time to call it quits for the evening. But once again, as always, I am totally and completely honored, totally and completely stunned by the fact that we've got 23 people who decided that they wanted to spend their Saturday evening listening to me talk about starships. I am thankful for the fact that you don't have a better place to be any more than I do. But I could be someplace else. I chose to be here instead. So I appreciate the fact that you guys decided to be here with me. And with that, I will not see you next week. Maybe, well, it depends on the weather. The weather is good, you will not see me next week. If the weather is bad for like the 4th week in a row, you will see me next week. But you will see me the week after that, if not. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening. See you next time.